Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, getting you set for championship weekend in college football. And, of course, the Power 5 kicks off with the Pac-12 with Washington taking on Utah. We've got Chris Fetters on the line from Dogman. It's the 247 platform for Washington Athletics. Chris, we appreciate you stopping by.
Absolutely, Mark. Anytime.
So this is where Washington expected to be. This is where most of us expected the Huskies to be when the season concluded, although the focus was on Washington State during the last few weeks of the season because of the potential to get to a college football playoff with one loss. But when it was all said and done, Chris, the more physical, more talented roster still won out, as has been the case between these two teams for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, it just does feel like the defensive system that Pete Kwiatkowski started and now Jimmy Lake is using with Kwiatkowski's help has really just kind of neutralized anything that Mike Leach has done with that air raid attack. And then you add the elements to it. It really, one of the analysts in the Seattle area said that it looked like Gardner Minshew was just kind of basically freaked out about the whole thing. And we don't even know if he'd ever played in snow before. And so that could be a tremendous equalizer when you're trying to play against an offense that really focuses a lot on the details and there's a lot of timing in those routes. And you don't know about the footing. And there were so many things that were going into it. And Washington was able to really just kind of rush three and sit back and then just kind of let Minshew take the easy money. But they were never going to do anything with 2 and 3 yard gains. It just was never going to happen. So, at halftime, I think Minshew had completed like 20 some passes, but he hadn't even gotten 100 yards. Whereas Jake Browning had almost 150 yards, and I think he'd completed like 5 passes. So it really was a huge contrast in styles. And then obviously the running of Myles Gaskin and that last drive felt like, okay, they could have really just stepped there, put their boot on the throat any time and just kind of rumbled down the field and 8 clock, and that was all she wrote.
When you've got a national perspective, and a lot of the people that watch my show here are constantly talking college football playoff. So away from the fans that are locked in and just watching that particular team or conference, there's this college football narrative that runs all the time. And so for Washington, they were one of the prime players in that. The Auburn loss took a bit off of that, but then there were still thoughts, okay, if they get through the Pac-12 unscathed, well, it didn't last for very long. And so they were kind of taken off the map. Still a very good team, still high in the rankings in the 15 range most of the season. But do the people that are closer to the program, like yourself, and also just the players themselves, seem to feel that difference of expectations and where we stand and how many people are hyper focused on us, or we're kind of off the national radar?
Well, I think historically, Mark, the old idea of a Pac-12 team going to a Rose Bowl has always been first and foremost. I mean, yes, now since 2011, winning this Pac-12 championship factors into it as well. So winning your conference has been huge, but back in the day, winning your conference in the Pac-10, Pac-8, whatever conference you wanted to call it back in the day, winning this conference meant you got to go to the Rose Bowl. And you usually played the powerhouse Big Ten team at the time, whether it was Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin was huge back in the 60s and 70s. You had Minnesota was playing well. Obviously, Penn State's played well as well. But Washington has not been to the Rose Bowl since 2000, and they played Drew Brees' Purdue team and beat them. And so Washington fans, especially the older ones in my generation and beyond, have been clamoring for the Huskies to get back to the Rose Bowl. They would almost rather see them get to a Rose Bowl and win than get to a college football semifinal against Alabama like they did 2 years ago and lose. It wasn't that they weren't competitive in that game, but it just never felt like they were on the same footing. So yeah, it's weird in that sense, because I think most college football fans would say, well, wait a second, if you would rather just go to a bowl game than play for the playoff and get in the playoff, you're thinking things backwards. And I get that. It does sound counterintuitive. But again, when you factor in the tradition of what this conference represents, and they call the Rose Bowl the granddaddy of them all for a reason, it holds a lot of prestige, and there is a lot of history that goes into that game. And so for Washington to get to the Rose Bowl and and compete at that. And it is a New Year's Six game, so it's not like it really should take that much of a back seat to a semifinal game, because again, you've got 129 Division I teams, and only 4 are going to be able to make those semifinals. It's not exactly like you're talking about great odds to begin with. And yes, Washington was thought of as maybe a potential playoff team in the beginning, but that loss to Auburn just continues to look worse and worse and worse and worse, the worse that Auburn plays, for instance. And then you compound that with the fact that the Pac-12, arguably their best non-conference win was Arizona State beating Michigan State. That's not a great look for the Pac-12 at all. I mean, Washington took care of BYU after BYU took care of Wisconsin, but now BYU is looking like a fairly average team. They're not looking all that great. So again, when you look at a down Pac-12, USC is not doing anything. UCLA's having to come back because they just switched head coaches. Oregon with the same thing. Washington State made their run, but Washington State is who they are. They're not going to change offensively. Defensively, they played better, but they just are. Their ceiling is there. Everyone can see what it is. They're not going to change. So in all of those circumstances, I think that made it really, really tough for Washington to try to push through and compete with, the Ohio States and the Oklahomas in that discussion of trying to get into that very, very last spot. And I wrote an article about it after the Auburn game, Mark, saying, look, I think even at a 11-1, I think Washington's going to have a really tough time trying to get in this playoff for all of those reasons. And it kind of worked out. I mean, Notre Dame is obviously the huge X factor there. When you bring in an undefeated Notre Dame team that doesn't have to play a conference championship game, that turns the tables on a lot of this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think on the one hand, to kind of go back to answer your question, I think on the one hand, Washington fans are kind of bummed out that playoff dream kind of didn't materialize right off the bat. But at the same time, if you would have told them, oh, by the way, you make it to the Pac-12 title game, oh, by the way, the winner goes to the Rose Bowl, I still think they'd be super, super pleased with that.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make, because if you look at the establishment of this program back as a power within the Pac-12, well, this is now a 3-year run. So you got a block of time versus just jumping up and winning a Pac-12 like Colorado in making it to the Pac-12 championship game a couple of years ago. Well, that was just a quick spurt that was an aberration. But for Washington, completing this goal of getting to the Rose Bowl, winning a Pac-12 championship after they won one 2 years ago, the middle season, even though they didn't win the Pac-12, they went to the Fiesta Bowl. They were still largely considered most likely the best team in the Pac-12. So it's a block of time now that's going to elevate them back to their glory days. And then individually, you've got a couple of historic players trying to finish off their runs through the Pac-12, and talking about Myles Gaskin and Jake Browning, which they've basically are finishing prolific careers in which they're going to write their names in Pac-12 record books for wins and yardage and all those things.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, Jake Browning's already the winningest Pac-12 quarterback. If he gets this Pac-12 title, he will become the winningest Pac-12 quarterback. I'm beating out guys like Matt Leinart and some of those guys. I mean, that's a huge feather in the cap of a guy who, frankly, has been a lot more polarizing than he probably should have been, just because of maybe some of his physical limitations and what have you. I mean, for some reason, he's just a player that Washington fans have been really hot and cold about. And I've always been very bullish on Jake Browning. I think he's really taken this team to not so much a different level, but he's really kept things kind of ticking over at a very high level. And then Myles Gaskin, the 170 yards in the Apple Cup, that 80-yard touchdown run in the fourth quarter to really seal that win was the run that gave him the 1,000 yards for the season, making him the only player in Pac-12 history to have 4 1,000-yard seasons. And Mark, I mean, we know the running backs that have played in this conference, all O.J. Simpson all the way through. And for him to have that record by himself is an absolutely remarkable achievement. And then on top of it, earlier in the game, he got to 5,000 career yards, which we also know is a huge milestone. And when it's all said and done, he may end up about 1,500 yards ahead of Washington's next best running back career-wise, which was Napoleon Kaufman. And Napoleon was a phenomenal running back, had a nice career, probably didn't go as long as he would have wanted to in the NFL. But these, Corey Dillon only played really a season there. But you talk about Joe Steele all the way back in the late 70s with Don James, Jacques Robinson, who was a Rose Bowl MVP and an Orange Bowl MVP. Him and Leinart are the only guys that have ever done that in the history of college football. So you're talking about some guys that have really put together some years, and yet Myles Gaskin is going to be heads and tails above all of those guys when you look at it from a historical perspective. There is no question. And again, when we talk about those kind of talents and the way nowadays everyone's looking at these guys as 3 years into the NFL, when's the next time we're going to see a 4-year starter at quarterback, a 4-year starter at running back, and then if Trey Adams had not gotten hurt, we could have seen a 4-year starter at left tackle, all in the same offense. This could have been something we may never have seen in our lifetimes ever again. Now Trey is expected to probably come back because he's starting to play again, and he will play in the championship game on Friday. But he has enough games left where he can play one more game, and if they make it to the Rose Bowl, and he will still retain his year of eligibility because he's only come back for the last couple of games. But again, you're right. I mean, these guys have been historic in many, many ways, and I think the one thing that's really missing from their resume, Mark, is a Rose Bowl win. And well, first of all, getting to the Rose Bowl and then a Rose Bowl win, because they've won the Pac-12 title before. That's golden for them. They want to get there. They want to do that again. But to get to that Rose Bowl historically, because they grew up watching it, and then to get that win, whoever they play, arguably probably Michigan and Ohio State. That's probably what we're thinking about. To get that kind of feather in their camp to finish off their careers would be truly remarkable, and probably put that recruiting class and that 2018 class as one of the better classes in the history of Washington football.
Jacques Robinson. Wow, there's a name from the past. So
there you go. Nate Robinson's father.
That's right. Yes.
Yep.
So he would have won the Rose Bowl MVP against Iowa, correct? And then
That's
he won
true.
it against
28-0.
Yes, and then won the Orange Bowl against Oklahoma.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. 84 season. Okay, very good. All right, back to the here and now. I can talk historic stuff forever, but before we get to the nuts and bolts of the Utah matchup, so this is the best program in the Pac-12 right now, and like a top 10 to 15 national program.
Well, yeah, I mean, what were they in the start of the season? 7, 6, 7, somewhere around there?
Yeah, not just this particular team, but Chris Peterson now, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is a 3-year block now.
Yeah.
And so he's got this thing at a place where it's recyclable. He's got the recruiting rotation going and bringing in the class athletes, and he's in a good place where this is going to reload every year, basically.
There's no question. And then obviously a guy like Jimmy Lake is going to be a name that's associated with some of these coaching jobs that are coming up, like with Colorado and some of these other things. But he feels really good about where he's at right now. He's in this coordinator position, which is what he really coveted, to be able to take that next jump up when he felt ready to do it. But so I think he's good there. But I think at the same time, family-wise, they just bought a house. His family is in a good situation in Seattle. They like it here. He's a Washington kid. He grew up in Spokane, played his ball at Eastern Washington. So, Jimmy Lake is a guy that's going to be super, super coveted, and he has been. I know he was looked at by Arizona State before they hired Herm Edwards last year. So he's going to be a name that's always going to be in that mix. So retaining the coach is a huge part of what they're about, and making it lucrative and letting those other guys push on, but also showing the coaches outside that, hey, there's upward mobility at Washington. There's stability if you want it. And so there's a lot of different dynamics that are going there that are very appealing on the outside for coaches that want to come in, that are quality coaches that want to be a part of something that Chris Peterson is definitely building. And then you add on top of it the recruiting aspect. The recruiting piece is getting better and better every year. And they just got a commitment actually from a 2021 quarterback locally, who is the son of Damon Heward, who was the quarterback of the mid-90s at Washington. He's the one that engineered the whammy in Miami and all that stuff. And then he had a pretty long career. I think he played for the Chiefs and played for a couple of other teams. But, Damon is a guy that's a real fixture in the community with the University of Washington. Now his son, Sam, committed, and he's a class of 2021 guy. He's considered by 24/7 to be the top kind of drop back guy and not dual threat, but just kind of traditional pocket passer in America. So they're doing a really, really good job already of trying to reach out and get some guys for the future. And recruiting is literally 3 weeks away from today is signing day. And they're doing a really, really nice job on in the islands, for instance, in Hawaii. So I think there's certainly trending up. You hear right now this week about all of the guys that are kind of out on the road and checking things out because they're not playing in the Pac-12 title game. So Washington, it's kind of one of those weird things where you hear all these stories about all these coaches going out and making visits and in homes and all that stuff. Well, Washington's sitting there going, yeah, well, we're preparing for a championship. And so that can be pretty compelling on the recruiting front too, when they are able to go in and have in-home visits with families and coaches and what have you too. So again, you're right. I mean, if you look at it, top 15, for instance, and you break it down by like the Power 5 conferences, let's just say generically, that means Washington would be in the top 3 in the Pac-12 if you gave every conference 3 teams to create a top 15. Now, it's not going to be perfect that way, but definitely Washington's in the top 3 of the Pac-12 for sure. You could put them in number 1. And if you put them in number 1, does that all of a sudden bump them a lot closer to the top 10? Yeah, I think they're right on the cusp. I think you could make a legitimate argument on a number of fronts.
Washington, Utah face off for the Pac-12 championship. It was USC with a win, the first for the South since the conference went to this format of a championship game, I believe, in 2011. But basically, it's been a Oregon-Stanford run, and then Washington jumped in a couple years ago against Colorado in annihilating the Buffs. USC finally won over Stanford last year. Utah and Washington, they met back on September 15th with the Huskies prevailing 21-7. We got Chris Fetters on the line from dogman.com. It's the 24/7 platform for Washington. So what do you remember about that game?
That was a really crazy game, Mark, in a number of different ways. It started out really, really good for Washington. Gaskin had a 38-yard touchdown on their very, very first drive. They were shutting down the Utah offense, which was kind of in a funk at that point. And they had Tyler Huntley healthy. They had Zach Moss healthy, both of which are not going to be playing on Friday. So in a lot of ways, what Washington's going to be seeing is not so much a very different offense schematically, but in terms of personnel, they're going to see a few different guys that they did not see that day. But, there was some turnovers in that game. Utah had a couple guys ejected for targeting, which were kind of controversial calls, if I remember at that time. And that definitely affected them defensively. And Washington did enough offensively to kind of get the job done, but they shot themselves in the foot a little bit too. But it was really a screwy game in the fourth quarter because Washington was up by 2 scores. And yet Utah had like 3 or 4 possessions in Washington territory. Washington gave them a turnover on one of them. Should have been a pick 6, but it was one of those big man rumbles, and he unfortunately kind of lost the ball and it went out of bounds. But Washington actually they kept them scoreless. There was like 3 or 4 possessions where they were inside the 30-yard line of Washington and they came away with no points. And I just don't know if you'll ever see that. You don't see that very often at all. I mean, they were able to stop them on 4th downs on a number of occasions. Utah kind of stopped themselves by not catching some key passes. So it was just a very, very unusual game. And I think there's going to be plenty of carryover from it because Washington really imposed themselves physically on Utah. I mean, they really beat up like Britton Covey. Their main kind of offensive threat in terms of their skill guy. He's a guy that they like to include in their fly motion, their fly sweep game. And he's a smaller kid, but he's quick and he's fast and he can find the seams and he can find those little pockets to catch passes and then he's a real danger in the return game as well, in the punt return game. And they just really obliterated him. I mean, if you can barely see it, but if you look at the College Game Day opening with who's the band? Is it Big and Rich? No, Big and Rich. Is that who? I can't remember who it is.
That's a great question. You got one.
I think it is that. But the band, they have the montage, and when they have the montage of the guys with the really big hits, you'll see the hit of Byron Murphy on Britton Covey on just a little flat route where he turns around once he's caught the ball and Murphy just puts his shoulder right into his chest and just decleats him, and it's brutal. And it didn't get any better for Covey. Covey ended up, I think, with a couple fumbles off of big hits. Guys were coming from behind and stripping him the ball. And then at the very end, JoJo McIntosh kind of decleats him near the goal line on a fourth down. And Huntley was just kind of throwing these guys hospital passes. And it got, frankly, got kind of ugly where the guys that were doing the broadcast for ESPN, I believe it was was it Brian Greasy? I think that was doing the color. He basically said, guys, you just got to stop. You got to take him out of the game because he doesn't want to come out of the game, but for his safety, he needs to come out. And you don't see that very often. So I expect Washington to still really physically impose themselves on Utah, but Utah is so physically tough, and they're really a microcosm of Kyle Whittingham, who's a really tough guy and just really sound. They're great special teams, obviously, with Wisnowski and Matt Gay, their kicker. I mean, they just do a phenomenal job in special teams. So I think, again, you can take a lot from that September game. But, again, when you have a new quarterback in Jason Shelley, who actually has a connection with Washington because his dad played at Washington, Jason Shelley, but he got kicked out. So I don't know if that means anything to his son. But Jason Shelley is a really elusive kid, and he's playing with a lot of confidence right now. And then you have Armand Shine replacing Zach Moss, who's not really as big or as fast, but he's finding ways to be productive in that game. And then their other running back, Green, I think shows some real flashes as well. So they've got a younger receiving core, some freshmen and what have you. So I think it's going to be interesting, but I just don't see Washington taking the pedal off the metal in terms of their aggressiveness defensively. And then offensively, they bring all their weapons back in terms of Gaskin, in terms of guys like Aaron Fuller and Andre Bocelli and Ty Jones in the passing game. But then you bring Hunter Bryant into the mix, the sophomore tight end, who had a sensational Apple Cup, 3 catches for 108 yards. He just is to me, Mark, he's a real X factor in this game. This is just a guy that not a lot of teams can really prepare for because you can see him on tape and you can try to scheme for him, but he is just a playmaker. And I think Bush Hamden, the Washington offensive coordinator, does a great job of scheming him and getting him some real mismatches with some linebackers and some other players in space and in the seams. I think he could be the difference in this game.
I like what you did there, Chris, because you basically answered my next 2 questions because you basically outlined the physicality of the 2 teams in a league in which we stereotype it as finesse. Now, stereotypes sometimes have some truth to them, but when it comes to these 2 teams, that's out the door. They're physical football teams. So that belies the Pac-12 narrative of finesse. And number 2, that teams change throughout the year. So if we played video games with these guys, it would be the same result all the time. But it's not. That was a September game played in a different location, and Zach Moss is hurt. Other guys, a different quarterback, as you mentioned, in play at Utah, and just things have changed. Is there anything else that comes to mind in regards to the Huskies that make them a different football team almost 3 months later?
Well, I mentioned some of the X factors in terms of guys that didn't play in that September game that could factor. There's certainly some other guys, but I will say just in general, Mark, when you talk to guys like Chris Peterson and Kyle Whittingham, and you mention to them, oh, by the way, the number 1 and number 2 scoring defenses in the Pac-12 happen to be the teams that made it to the Pac-12 title game, you won't find them surprised by that in the least. Because again, the cliche is what? Defense wins championships. And right now you've got the 2 best defenses that are going to be going head to head. And that's why I think ultimately this is going to be probably a lowish scoring game. But when you look at player personnel, and obviously I kind of highlighted the guys that for Utah that are going to be brand new in this game. I think Washington's got some guys, and not just new guys, but guys that are coming back off of injury that weren't ready back then, but also some guys that are starting to develop a little bit. And pretty much a lot of them are on defense. I think on the defensive line and the outside linebacker position, there's a guy the last couple of games, a redshirt freshman by the name of Joe Tryon, who's about 6'5", 6'5.5", about 265. He's just a creature athletically. I mean, he's a guy that just runs all day. And he got a sack in the Apple Cup, his first of his career. I think he's just brimming with confidence, and I think he's one of those guys that Washington can rely on as an edge guy, where they've had good edge guys, but they haven't gotten really like big time impact upfield rush guys. They've had good guys that can really set the edge and really make it difficult for teams to get around them, but they have not been able to really push upfield and really cause problems in the backfield and in the pocket. A guy like Joe Tryon can do that. And then the other guys that I would think are going to make an impact, or there's a couple of linebackers that are coming back that were injured early in the season, and DJ Beavers, who's more of that Mike, that middle linebacker, that bigger style guy, and then also Brandon Wellington. Those two guys are very experienced. They have a lot of football under their belt, and they've really impacted the last couple of games that Washington's played. So there's going to be a nice rotational mix inside with Ben Burkervin and Tevis Bartlett being that first team. And then you've got them backed up with DJ Beavers and Brandon Wellington. That's a super, super experienced group. And then in the back end, you've got all these guys. I mean, they were playing 5-6 DBs against Washington State. You won't necessarily see a ton of that in this game Friday, in my opinion, but you still will see a big rotation of defensive backs. And one of the guys that I think has really come on strong and had a big year because Jordan Miller got hurt and had to come in. This guy had to come in as a cornerback and play is Keith Taylor. And Keith Taylor is a huge kid. He's 6'2", about 200 pounds, and he's as physical as they come out on the edge. And so, I know Utah's going to try to throw some of these bigger guys at him out on the edge and what have you. But I just don't think I just think that he's going to be a factor in this game. I just think that he could be one of those guys. I think it impacts it on the back end. There are going to be some nickel and dime guys like Elijah Molden and Miles Bryant. And they've even had some of their true freshman guys that have played and that have been available. But some of those guys are on their second or third game. So it's they're clearly at this point right now, Mark, that they want to redshirt this entire class. So I don't know if they're going to play much. And a guy like Kyler Gordon, the true freshman from Everett, he's the only true freshman that's actually played a position on defense. Most all of them have just been on special teams, on cover teams. So I really think that a guy like Keith Taylor, Elijah Molden, Miles Bryant, some of these other guys are going to be real impact guys. And can really fit in a number of different roles because they're starting to become very experienced.
Certainly encourage all of you to check out Chris Fetter's work at 247 Sports site for Washington Athletics. So it's dogman.com. And Chris does an exceptional job. And Chris, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to bringing you guys on, getting the rundown of personnel and guys I don't know about, guys on the cutting edge that are going to be prominent next year, and just soaking in all that information and insight. So you do a great job. So I appreciate you jumping on here.
Of course. Absolutely.
Enjoy the game.
Thank you. I will. It'll be fun.